France's reputation has been tarnished by World War II. Giving up so early to the Germans meant the French have been mocked for decades afterwards as surrender monkeys and cowards. However, what would have occurred if instead France kept the war going after the seizure of Paris? How would the world be different? What would borders be like? What would wars, culture, and demographics be like? That is the question of this alternate history. The answers may surprise you. If we look at the totality of French history, France is one of the most, if not the most successful military in history. In too many wars to count, French forces have fought with unbelievable bravery. World War II was very much the exception here. In fact, the reason for France's early surrender in World War II was due to their immense courage and sacrifice in World War I, in which French soldiers fought with insane bravery. The French losses in World War I were so horrifying that they lost more men than all the US, a much larger country's casualties for all its history combined. The losses from World War I were so horrifying that France went from being one of those bellicose nations in the world to having a climate of pacifism. The reaction against all the horror and death made French intellectuals come to the conclusion that war was always inherently wrong. This was summed up in the general attitude that it was better to be a German than to fight a war. A very similar sentiment was made by German pacifists in the post-World War II era with "better red than dead." When the Germans invaded France and beat the French army, this pacifist sentiment reared up, and the French, not knowing how evil the Nazis were yet, signed a peace treaty and gave up. Funnily enough, most of the intellectuals who'd said stuff like "it is better to be German than fight a war" either fled to the UK or joined the resistance. The reason I'm saying this is primarily a psychological issue is that on paper, France had a superior military to Germany. In 1939, looking at equipment and numbers, while ignoring the human element, as experts often do, everyone who knew anything thought France would win. However, France's timid defense and strategy, while Germany adopted blitzkrieg and new tactics, is what resulted in France's defeat. In this timeline, the decisive factor is Pétain. He was a French commander in the First World War, and by the time World War II rolled around was the French hero. Pétain was the hero of Verdun and was seen as a sacred celebrity figure. Sort of like if Churchill was still alive today and combined with Elon Musk without the dumbassery. Pétain made a declaration after the fall of Paris that France should surrender and give the Germans what they wanted. Pétain told the French people to side with the Germans and gave the Vichy government a great deal of legitimacy. In this timeline, the opposite occurs. Pétain flees to Bordeaux and gives a fiery speech, telling the French to keep fighting until the end. He reforms the French military based out of Bordeaux and keeps the war going. France is a very bureaucratic and hierarchical nation. This is why the French armies in places like Senegal, Madagascar, and Algeria sided with Vichy France rather than forming their own free government, even though, in fact, they had no strategic reason to do so since they were so far removed from an actual Nazi army. This doesn't happen, and the French Empire remains loyal to Pétain, who becomes the symbol of France's desire to keep fighting. The French wouldn't have been able to win the war inside France itself. The Germans were already occupying France's industrial heartland, which lies in the northeast of Paris, and once the Seine Valley had been seized, there really isn't any strategic line that can be held since the North European plain gets wider. The British army had already fled back home, thus leaving the outgunned French military to keep fighting alone. The French could probably hold out in Bordeaux for a month until the Germans would seize it, thus seizing all of continental France. However, France had a large colonial empire that they could easily relocate to. After the French government in Bordeaux would prove tenuous, Algiers on the other side of the Mediterranean would be much more stable. A very important variable is that the French Navy in Toulon would remain loyal to the Allies rather than turning to Vichy, likely relocating to Tunis. The French Navy wasn't very important in our timeline, since the British destroyed them in port shortly after their turning to Vichy. However, with them remaining an important part of the Allied force, it would result in complete Allied domination of the Mediterranean. Algeria was fairly developed, with a French population of around 1 million, which they could recruit from. The French would not be in an unbelievably shabby position. With the French in North Africa as a major force, they'd be able to team up with the British in Egypt to drive the Italians out of Libya, thus completely taking over North Africa. This would limit the North Africa campaign and make Rommel a minor commander on the Eastern Front, in which his talents for mobile warfare get subsumed by the immense numbers of that front. With total control of the Mediterranean, the Allies would be able to seize Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia fairly easily. Knowing there could be no way to hold it, the Germans would never have invaded and conquered Crete. With control of the ocean, the Allies would likely re-seize control of the Peloponnese Peninsula and Greece in 1941. The Allies, like our timeline, would invade Italy, however, several years earlier, and the Italians would surrender, thus resulting in Germany seizing control of the peninsula. World War II was fairly similar, with the exception that it sped up by several years. The Americans start somewhere around Capua rather than in North Africa. D-Day is able to happen earlier, with the Americans having to plan both the Italian and North African landing campaigns. With the Western Allies having a base in Greece, that would mean they could occupy more of the Balkans rather than having it turn mostly communist. This would result in much more of Europe being part of the Western sphere of influence than the Soviet. Let's say the war ends a year earlier. That means all of Germany and much of the Balkans goes to the Western Allies. It's even possible Poland, under the Warsaw Rising, would be able to organize into a buffer state between the American and Soviet spheres of influence, with the Soviets taking Romania, Eastern Poland, and the Baltics. Similarly, with the European War ending a year earlier, you would think the Pacific War would be sped up. However, the prospect of an invasion of Japan would be so horrifying that Harry Truman would still wait until the discovery of the bomb before launching it. This would mean that World War II in the Pacific would end on roughly similar timing. However, this would give the Russians more time to operate in this region, and so all of Korea would be united under the insane Kim dynasty. An earlier ending eliminates some of the worst parts of the Holocaust, meaning Europe would have many more Jews in this timeline. The Cold War would be less of the world struggle, with the Soviets in a much weaker position. The Soviets would continually try to conquer Poland to move Russia's flat borders outwards, which would probably result in Poland entering the Western sphere of influence and possibly even resulting in a world war, which would have to be in the early 1950s when neither side would have the nuclear capabilities to end the human race yet. With Algeria acting as the capital during the war, it would carry immense emotional significance in the post-war era for the French war leadership. The French didn't have to give up Algeria in our timeline. Like Vietnam, they actually won the military campaign itself, but lost the battle of public opinion. The decision went to de Gaulle, who in this timeline never becomes an important figure by not being able to pose as the heroic Frenchman who stood up to the Nazis, the honor of which goes to Pétain, who practically becomes Francis Churchill or Abraham Lincoln combined in this timeline. Thus, the French would keep Algeria. The French would likely decolonize, or in all actuality, technically decolonize the rest of their African colonies. However, Algeria had been a French possession since 1830, was actually considered a part of France itself, and with 1 million Frenchmen would remain a part of France, although gradually being given more and more autonomous status. What a faultist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for future content. Or alternatively, check me out on Patreon, where I've got my history of the world and all sorts of cool maps. Or check me out on Twitter. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.